Well, hello, we're going to go ahead and get started. I see a number of folks still joining, but let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to this month's Autodesk Tandem webinar. My name is Adam Peter, and I'm the Customer Program Manager for the Autodesk Tandem team, and we are grateful to have you joining us today. I have a few housekeeping items as we get started. We are recording today's webinar. This recording will be available on our website, intandem.autodesk.com, on the resources page, so you can rewatch this webinar again. We will also post a link to the Autodesk Forums Tandem page. There is a Q&A tab within Zoom, and we will use that throughout the webinar to answer questions today. There's also a chat area, and we would love to interact with you there as well. So please do keep questions in the Q&A section to make it easier for our team to answer your questions. And we're also going to pick from those questions for our live Q&A at the end of the webinar. Tim, if you could advance a slide, please. Because we may include future statements about planned or future development, anything we say today could change over time and is not a promise or guarantee of future delivery. Therefore, you should not make purchasing decisions based on statements made during this webinar. So let me go ahead and introduce you to today's speakers. We're pleased once again to have with us Bob Bray, the Senior Director and Manager for the Autodesk Tandem team. I would also like to welcome Tim Kelly and Hallie Larson, who are product managers on the Autodesk Tandem team as well. Today, Bob is going to provide the Autodesk perspective on digital twins by sharing some thoughts about the Autodesk Tandem vision and direction. Tim is going to present an update on recent enhancements, and then Hallie is going to walk us through some work in progress that introduces curated views when interacting with spatial data, as well as the integration of time series data from operational systems. Of course, as always, we're going to leave some time for questions, live questions and answers at the end. So please do, again, use that Q&A tab as we go along to get your questions in the queue. Now, before I hand it over to Bob, we have a couple questions that we would like to ask of you attending today, so we can get maybe a little better perspective on who's in our audience today. So our first poll question today is, what is your role? So we're just kind of interested to get some context about that today. So we'll go ahead and leave that open here for a few moments. Excellent. Look like we're getting really great participation. If you happen to fill the other option there in the poll, you can go ahead and use the chat and just shout out what your role is there so we can have some extra context for that. Excellent. Looks like we've got the numbers slowing down a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and end that. And just give everybody a minute to sort of see what we have there for the answers. So it looks like we've got a really good blend of folks joining us today. So thank you for your participation there. Our next question has to do with your digital twin journey. So we're curious to get a better understanding of where you're at on your digital twin journey. Great, looks like we're getting some really good participation there as well. I'm going to go ahead and leave that open for a few more moments till we get a few more answers. Try to get the last few in here. This is good context, so we appreciate you participating. All right, it looks like, again, we have a good blend here of folks that are fairly early on the process as well. So hopefully you'll get some, I think you'll get some really good context for where Autodesk is in the digital twin journey as well. And actually with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started and hand it over to Bob. Bob, thanks for joining us today. We're glad to have you here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Adam. Tim, do you want to go ahead and advance another slide? At Autodesk, as we've thought about digital twins, we know the industry has struggled for years with the idea of how do we take all of that project data created in design and engineering and actually get it into operations to make it useful. This is where we started our journey around digital twin. How do we enable BIM to FM to actually happen in a repeatable, effective way? We call this digital handover, where we really want to accelerate operational readiness by really starting with the end in mind and giving project teams and owners the tools to deliver data to an owner in a digital form, a descriptive digital twin, as we like to call it. And we'll get to that in just a minute. Then we'll take that and we want to take that and augment that with operational data, giving an owner a way to break down their silos, create that single pane of glass to operate their facilities more effectively, eventually leading to this idea of predictive insights. Next slide, Tim. We've really built our roadmap and our plans, and we talk to customers all the time about this digital twin maturity model. We find this model very effective in breaking down the problem into discrete chunks that make it much more approachable. Starts with this idea of a descriptive twin, that idea that you have a digital replica that has the information an owner needs about their as-built asset. Does not need to contain every nut and bolt in the curtain wall and a bunch of LED 500 level Revit models. Needs to contain the spaces, the equipment, the systems, and the ontology of how those things connect together. Informative twins add this idea of connectivity to operational systems, breaking down those silos of data, connectivity to work order management systems, to IoT and performance management data, to building management systems, creating that single pane of glass, and then taking that data one step further and using it to do predictive analytics. When might this component fail based on past behavior within my portfolio of facilities? And eventually moving on up into the idea that you can do what if simulation and eventually have a twin that can do autonomous control of a facility. Next slide. As we think about our roadmap, we're really building into these phases of, first and foremost, focusing on this idea of twin building. We've been working on this for a couple of years. Those who have been following us know this journey quite well. We continue to invest heavily in this idea of twin building. How do we structure, gather, manage, and verify all of that facility data? How do we automate the ontological relationships, allowing for refinement, but getting as much as we can from the BIM data and the design and construction data? And then, of course, adding those operational system connections. As we go forward, what you'll see today from Hallie and Tim is our future roadmap around facility monitoring. We talked last time in our last webinar with King Walmsley about all of the work on Project Dasher. This is about bringing forward a simplified experience for operations professionals, that single pane of glass, if you will, including pre-configured views of that operational data in context, using the model as a contextual reference, and of course, having configurable dashboards for actionable insight. And eventually, of course, moving on into optimizing a portfolio through predictive analytics. Again, being able to roll up that data across a portfolio of facilities and enabling the types of analytics you need to predict future events, suggest actions for tuning and operational efficiency. Next slide, Tim. All of this is built on something we call the Tandem platform. And the Tandem platform is built on Forge. Starts with this idea of a REST API, which will be in beta in the very near future. Really providing read-write access to all of the asset data and all of the operational event history or the time series data. On top of that, we're building what we call the Tandem SDK. This is really a higher level API with all of our digital twin business logic that is embeddable on the client side. So you can create a custom application for a digital twin. And it's also usable on the server side if you just want to execute that business logic on the server side. And then eventually, of course, what we really want to do is enable Tandem, the product, to be also a platform, enabling those vertical integrations through a marketplace, if you will, and supporting the kinds of custom data analytics that our customers need to support for the problems they want to solve. From an Autodesk perspective around digital twins, it's very much about how do we help our customers create a very repeatable process around digital twins through both our product and our platform roadmap. Tim, with that, I think I'll hand it over to you to talk about product
Perfect.
updates.
Thanks, Bob. Sounds good. Jumping into product review, I'll quickly share a couple items we're going to talk through. I'll give an update on parameters and templates. As Bob talked about that twin building experience, something that we've invested in is how we, again, make this a practice around your BIM process and export or an output of that workflow. With that said, there has been a recent release that allows for default content to be created or leveraged within Tandem with our templates. And ultimately, with that default content, we made a shift in what we previously had as parameter sets into individual parameter management. After I provide that update on this recent release, Hallie will take over and walk through two components that we're working on with our engineering team at the moment, spaces and operational data and context. So first, with parameters and templates, the work here is in that managed space within Tandem and ultimately surfaces throughout your facility as you apply that template to a facility. But to get people started on pilots more readily, we have introduced a library of content or a default content to get you started. So that's both in the parameters and in the template. So you can create a facility and right off the bat engage with our template data that we provided as part of that library. With the shift from parameter sets to a global list of parameters, as we were working through providing and creating that default content, we realized there were kind of two stages of interactions with kind of grouping or managing parameters. First of which was defining a set, and then second of which was applying a set within a facility template. So with that in mind, we made a shift to managing a global list of parameters to simplify that interaction and also to provide greater flexibility across in engaging with a number of different templates and how parameters are rolled out across those templates. So really quickly, I'm going to actually jump into the product and we'll share a bit about how that works today and what that looks like in the product, and then I'll pass it over to Hallie. So within Tandem, I'm going to jump into the managed space and jump straight to parameters. Previously, on this page, I had a list of sets, and I would navigate into a parameter set and add my parameters there. Now within this space, simply I have a dialog for creating new parameters. And with the change from a set name to individual parameters, we've also introduced categories. So I can still categorize these and group them together. I can either pick one or I can free type and say this is part of my parameters. And same thing as previously, I can set the context, give it a data type, any restrictions if appropriate, and create my parameter there. Now, leveraging these parameters, we are still working on some redesign in this, but the facility template works as it did previously with parameter sets, where if I create a facility template, I'm going to select the classification system I want to leverage. And then as I apply my parameters, now I'm applying individual parameters. Important note here is I can still search by any of the previously defined sets within our system are still here. So if I search for life, safety, that was now previously the set name, now that's the category name. So anything that has a category associated, you're going to be able to search by both the parameter name as well as that category name. So what you'll also notice here is we have your custom parameters, any parameters that you've created, as well as those library or standard parameter set that we've incorporated with those facility templates. When creating your facility, quick note here is as I create a new facility, right off the bat, I can leverage either my custom templates or our sample templates, so those that default content that we've provided. So before I shift over to Hallie and we dive into spaces, I want to quickly show an interaction in our product today and something that we're working to change or improve the experience around interacting with spatial data. So in Tandem, we do provide a service when publishing models where spaces are leveraged and cross-referenced with all of your models and allow for filtering or interacting with content within a given space. So I can search for my mechanical room and I can isolate the content within that room. I can see that spatial boundary. and ultimately I can interact with the parameters of that space. However, if I sort of click off of it within this interaction, there's not a really a good way to get back into that parameter information on that property panel for the space. And then if I'd like to interact with a list of spaces, right now the way to do that within Tandem is ultimately leveraging the Revit category. So if I go turn on, in this case, I'm going to turn on my rooms, I can now see, well, maybe I can't see. I've got something strange going on with my viewer where I don't see those rooms, but ultimately in the viewer, I can see those rooms and I can interact with that room data, and I can now select a room and see those properties. We feel that's a bit buried, and ultimately assets, spaces, and systems are key constructs that we want to interact with that data within Tandem. So we want to surface that information in a better way. With that said, I'm going to jump back into slides and hand it over to Hallie.
Thanks, Tim. So yeah, I'm going to dive in on some design work. What you see here is an initial concept around the addition of a spaces panel in Tandem and some pre-configured views. So the spatial nature of the BIM data really provides that descriptive digital twin context that Bob introduced at the beginning. And this is a way to interact with assets in Tandem today, and it'll continue to be this kind of key organizing principle around how disparate data sets become aligned together in a digital twin context. So today, as Tim just showed, the spatial data is available using explicit filtering capabilities, and you really have to dive into the filter panel to get to it. And so our goal here is to provide easier access to this class of data. And as we're doing this, we're planning out capabilities for this panel and these curated views that help with model navigation. These would be based primarily on rooms and levels coming out of Revit or IFC data. And in terms of what we're sharing here today, we're interested in your feedback on your preferred user experience around how to interact with this data in Tandem as we go forward. So jumping ahead, what we're looking for here is kind of a scope of work that includes a searchable, very user-friendly list of spaces that can be managed by type. That would be zone, room, level, etc. Sorting and grouping based on parameter data that you have available to your model. A selection mode for individual or group editing of that spatial data. So this is a way to really surface exactly what you want to edit in the properties panel. And then interactions that really provide these curated views, and we'll go into much more detail here. Another key piece is that all interactions with this panel are going to also be interlinked with that primary filtering mechanism we already have in Tandem today, and drive the kind of management of your facets as you interact. All right, so just quickly here, I'll dive into more detail on what these curated views look like, but the idea is that users will be able to select a primary interaction mode. So this will kind of take over how the viewer responds to interactions with spaces in the spaces panel and help manage what you're actually seeing in that 3D environment, kind of what Tim was just demonstrating. There's a few different options we have going forward. So I'm going to walk through these 4 modes and we'll do a poll to see kind of where people's preferences land. So the first one, if you can go one more slide ahead, Tim, is an isolated assets view. So this is really kind of the version of what Tim showed you in product just now. In this case, it has a refined set of Revit categories that are displayed for the assets that are actually contained within a room. So that would be something you could kind of manage for your own preferences. But here, when you select a room in that list, you really focus in on the content of that room. And if we go ahead one more slide, the next view here is taking advantage of the viewer clustering capability. So what this does is it then takes that same content and it clusters it by category. So here you see mechanical equipment, lighting equipment, electrical equipment, etc. So you have opportunities to kind of drill into these subsets of the data, but you have confidence that everything you're seeing here is really associated to that space that you're investigating. The next view takes this this particular isolated assets view a step further and allows you to do a multi-select. So in this case, 4 laundry rooms across 4 levels in the facility. And you can again start to see, okay, what assets are there? How does the data roll up across these 4 spaces? And this interaction would also drive what you're seeing in your inventory panel, so you can really drill down into this kind of curated subset of the data associated to these rooms. All right, switching to the second mode. On the next slide, what you'll see here is essentially a bird's eye view. So if you tuned in last month and saw Kian's talk on the capabilities in Dasher, here it's a kind of familiar experience that it's more looking at the level by level view of the whole floor. If you interact with a single room, you zoom into that level, you have that context data, but you can kind of see into the room itself. And jumping ahead one more slide, imagining kind of you have the full 3D interactivity of the viewer, and you can see into those rooms. Maybe there's furniture, maybe there's other data associated with that space. But here we start to have the opportunity to overlay additional kind of subsets of your spatial data, mechanical systems, electrical systems, and see their 3D context from above. The curation of this kind of view is really around what we're choosing to hide on your behalf. So ceiling panels, anything that would obstruct your kind of view of this aerial or bird's eye view would be managed on behalf of the user to interact with this view. And the next one here we're going to jump ahead to is the 2D floor plan views. So these are dynamically generated from the model data, and again interact with the filtering capabilities in Tandem. So here, if you're in this mode, you would select a room and you'd be able to go right to that 2D floor plan, zoom in kind of a traditional space planning mode, opportunities to color code based on room types, and see that room in context of its floor plan in that more kind of traditional mode that we're used to. But all this data is generated from the model. So what you can see here is you again have that opportunity to overlay illustrations of the mechanical systems or other geometry that you have associated, and dynamically interact with how you're seeing that in that 2D floor plan context. And lastly, we have one more view to look at, and that is an interior view. So here, this mode would be a click interaction with your room, would really take you inside the building, place you in the room, and enter into that 2D, first person navigation mode where you have the ability to walk around. It's kind of the gaming engine style interaction. And here you can look at the kind of full 3D space from an entirely different perspective than you would from the other views that we've talked about so far. So we're going to go one more slide just as a summary, zoom out and look at these four in comparison. And we're going to pop up a poll here. If Adam, you could throw that on the webinar. The hope here is to really get your perspective on which of these views are your preference. So based on what we shared, can you select your first and second pick in terms of how these views would add value to your use cases when interacting with spatial data in Tandem? And once you've answered this poll, please feel free to throw in the chat why you prefer a particular view and what your use case is for that. Or if there's something more nuanced that you'd like to see that hasn't been covered here, please feel free to add a comment about that as well.
And comments in the chat panel.
Yeah.
Really good interaction so far. And I'd say just as these are going, it looks like isolated assets and bird's eye are tied at about 36% each, followed by floor plans, and with last being room interior as the first preference. And interestingly enough, second preference is almost very evenly blended across the mix.
Thanks, Tammy. I will leave it just a moment more and then we can move on to the next section. So yeah, we're particularly excited about what this opportunity brings just to help navigate the kind of complexity of that 3D geometry for a variety of use cases. And as these interact with the filters panel and we begin layering in more operations data on top, you can imagine how you can kind of quickly get to the asset or data insights you're looking for in the context of that modeling environment.
Just an additional comment before we move on, Hallie. With the curated views, this is something that we want to begin surfacing across our product. Right now in Tandem, you have the ability to create really any of these views on your own. I can create a view that saves isolated assets or an isolated floor or navigation into a floor plan within a space. These can all be saved views and focused on specific data. What we're looking to do with this spaces interaction is ultimately begin creating content for you so that it's a simple single click and you're given a view that meets the needs. And with Tandem, we think about this interaction as a highly visual, capability where, I have, from that click, I have a clear understanding of what I'm trying to get to, or the point that I'm trying to get across as I'm doing system analysis or any sort of interrogation of the facility. So the idea with getting your feedback is, how do we start with a default and then expand from there? But I'd expect that in the coming months and these webinars, we want to start putting this kind of content forth more and more as we have our design team working on these kinds of interactions. So your feedback is much appreciated. And as Hallie mentioned, if you have any additional comments, do please add them in the chat.
Thanks, Tim, for that added context. All right, so we're going to jump into the next section here, which is moving on to operational data in context. So again, this is work in progress. Tim will do a demo at the end of kind of where we're at today. And what you're seeing here is some design mock-ups of where we're headed. This includes in particular a streams panel, similar to that spaces panel, but now targeting time series data. We'll go into that a little more detail. Interactive timeline charts for the display of time series data, and also the location of stream pins in the viewer space. So this, again, relates back to probably what you saw last week or last month in the context of the research team's work on Dasher and how we're bringing some of those capabilities forward in Tandem. So to dive a little bit deeper, what we're working towards here is an alpha release of these capabilities in Tandem around the storage and ingestion of time series data. So that includes API endpoints for ingesting historic time series data, as we're calling sort of streaming data. This would also include a user-friendly list of those streams, including their latest values, integration workflows to create and associate these streams with assets or spaces in the model to be able to visualize them in context. And then all those pins that help you understand the location inside the federated 3D view of your facility. And then lastly, charts for the visualization and comparison of those streams. And again, here there's an opportunity to manage stream properties and metadata in as much detail as is required for your use case based on Tandem's facility template workflows that Tim mentioned in the beginning. So really an opportunity to classify your data in ways that you wish and apply different parameters against those stream entities in the same way we do with asset properties today. And so just a little call out here into the chat. Someone's going to paste the tandem@product.autodesk.com email, but this is just to say, if you're interested in piloting a facility in Tandem and taking advantage of these early capabilities that we're implementing, please shoot us an email and we'll be happy to chat with you about how to get involved with the alpha of this content. So I'm going to go just slightly more in detail, kind of beyond time series data. So far we've talked about capabilities for storing time series data in Tandem itself. And then this data could really originate from a broad range of sources, such as building management systems or IoT sensors, rooftop weather stations or networked utility meters that might exist in a building, or even if you've got something running already on predictive ML models for your building, you could start to imagine the results of those being stored as time series data against your facility. And really this data is the foundation for starting to understand and monitor your building performance. So as we move towards this informative twin capability, again, back to what Bob mentioned at the beginning, we'll also be able to kind of contextualize and summarize this event data in context of the model as well. So beyond just streaming time series historic data, we want to look at these more discontinuous or erratic data sets around events that happen in a facility as well. So examples of event data are going to be your alerts. This could be triggered off of a stream, some value going out of bounds, or coming in from an external system. Possibility to work with alarms coming off of outages or faults in the building, things you really want to pay attention to. General actuation events, these are kind of the control system logic of the building itself. So coming off your building management system, access control systems, lighting systems, etc. And then additional event types could be status or state changes, scheduled or routine tasks, and work orders or tickets. So events happening on the data around those as well. So we're going to pause here again and run one more poll. The key question here for us is just thinking about these types of event data in Tandem. We'd like to understand what your priorities are for seeing this data contextualized in the model, and also with some dedicated summary visualizations. We expect to be able to see a lot of these events integrated in, but how much we curate visuals to the different types is the question we'd love your feedback on today. So it looks like we've started that poll and getting some good feedback. And again, in this context, if there's something that isn't shown here in our list of preferences, and we were just asking you to pick 2 from the multi-select, that would be your preference, please feel free to throw that in the chat as well for additional insights.
As people are picking there too, one, I think, Hallie, you mentioned this, but a key thing here is we sort of set this up to say pick 2 in the anticipation of this is some kind of correlation of data as well. So we, as Hallie said, we do expect to kind of tap into a number of different systems and bring data together for correlating that information and providing a unique experience in how you analyze that. But do think about, as you selected your 2, the data you might expect to see correlated together.
Yeah, we're looking like we've got quite a good neck and neck contenders against tickets and tasks and kind of general status indicators, as well as those broader concept of alerts. So it's looking great. Thanks for your participation. At this point, I'm going to hand it back to Tim, who's going to jump back into the product itself and just show you where we are today with the integration of time series data and visualizations on top of the model.
Awesome. Thanks, Hallie. So I did share this in the last webinar, but we'll step back into it again. That facility that Hallie was showing, we have a little under 100 sensors feeding data into Tandem right now for this facility. And this is work in progress, so you won't see this in the product. This is in our staging environment. But here I can turn on my pins, my string pins, and I can navigate the facility and interact with this data. So I have my current information, and ultimately I can kind of pan back in time. I can zoom into a specific period of time or zoom out across a period of time. If I need to select, time range, I have the opportunity to select a longer period of time. And then again, I can kind of navigate across this. As Hallie showed in a handful of those views, the idea here, as we move forward with designing the user experience for this is, we'll expect to see some of this data correlated within that interaction. We'll expand upon the streams panel where I can more directly interact with data here across multiple streams to aggregate or review information across those streams. But the idea here is we want to simplify the process of connecting that information to your digital twin experience or environment and feeding that information into a location that is this aggregation of data. I saw a few comments that said, we really need all of those data types, but we understand you have to prioritize. Certainly, our approach is the way we wanted to step into this was prioritize kind of the structure of how we interact with this data from a visual context, where I can navigate to a specific floor. It's going to filter down the appropriate sensors. I'm going to then just see only those sensors within that specific floor. So I have a clear way of interacting with and drilling into specific sensor information. As Hallie mentioned, our next step into that event data is less about the time series or telemetry data and more about that, visualizing the one-off events of these things happening. But again, the idea that we want to work toward is curating views, both with this time series or telemetry data in mind, as well as with that kind of interacting with the spatial or asset data specifically. Since I'm demoing right now, I'll go ahead and share. This is also a capability in our staging environment, not yet released to our production environment, but Hallie talked a bit about that notion of curating views and a dynamic floor plan as part of that and generating a floor plan. This is a capability underway right now. And I apologize, I'm having yet another technical issue with my demo environment, but this should generate a floor plan as you saw on the slide. So I'm going to go ahead and transition back to slides, maybe in the Q. There it goes. Apologies for that. So yeah, here's my floor plan. I can, within this floor plan, interact with the assets, interact with spaces, and ultimately with streams or that event information as well. So that's the idea behind generating a floor plan with specific content overlaid. With that said, we'll go ahead and transition into Q&A. So I think Bob and the team are going to come off of or come back onto video, and we'll have Adam field some questions.
Thanks, Tim, we're going to let you hang out there all by yourself.
I need, come on.
Great. Well, again, for those attending today, please do go ahead and use that Q&A panel to submit your questions. We have a number here that are sort of in the same vein. And Bob, maybe this is a good one for you to address, but the question is essentially, can Tandem be connected to an FM or FMIS or REM solution? And we have a number of those types of questions saying, can we connect to a CMMS system or other external systems, essentially?
Great question. We hear pretty much every day in our customer conversations. And as we roll out the API, we'll be working with partners to create those integrations. That is exactly a set of integrations we want to enable. Again, thinking about adding, building context, spatial context to a CMMS system, to a facility management system, integrating BIM data much closer into space management is another great example. So those are definitely connections that we are looking to enable, both some direct and some through, obviously, our partner ecosystem enabled through the APIs.
Great, thanks, Bob. We have another question here. The models are rarely set up properly in Revit for rooms or spaces, as they are a fixed height, and in the highlight of the space it displayed information in the plenum, which from Revit wouldn't exist. So how does this work, or is there a setting or adjustments that can be made in Tandem?
There is ongoing work in our engineering team at the moment to do two things. First of which is explore the workflow for expanding that spatial boundary. So as mentioned here, allow for the room boundary to incorporate 3 feet above or up to the deck above to capture that plenum space. So that's one thing, is that yes, you have a room bound by a ceiling, and that's the room geometry, and we leverage that room geometry to do that kind of intersection. We would allow for users to control where and how that intersection would take place. So that is work underway. The second thing is, in the case that you don't have a space created in Revit and you want to create spaces within Tandem, this is more investigation work at this point, but ultimately we want to define a path for creating spaces within Tandem where you can ultimately draw that geometry or create that contextual space as an object or a component within Tandem, in the case that they did not exist when you imported your models. Hallie, anything else on that to add?
I think that covers it well. Okay. You get a lot of variety of spatial heights out of Revit data for sure. So we want to mitigate that problem.
I'll just add one thing, Tim, which is that, we recognize that BIM data is almost never perfect. What we want to do is get as much out of it as we can and then allow for refinement. So if we can create system ontology out of Revit, for example, through connectivity of what we see in the geometry, and then allow you to refine any connections that maybe we didn't get right, then we can get you much further than just having to basically manually code that entire network or that system ontology. So that applies to spaces, systems, and all kinds of things.
Great discussion. Appreciate that. Another technical question: is it possible to map a shared parameter used in Revit to assign the classification code of an object with the classification used by Tandem so that it automatically recognized, as is the case for the assembly code parameter?
Yes, I'll quickly share that. Okay. So in the assets panel, where you're going to map in your facility template, and you're going to see all of the parameters associated, as Adam mentioned, currently, or as from when we release a product, we have the opportunity or the ability to map a Revit parameter into a Tandem parameter. Just recently, we've released the ability to map in a classification code. So if I have, let's say, assembly code is my code I want to map in, I'm going to select that. And now in the case that my classification system matches that, it's going to go find those values. I do need to hit apply here to do that, but it will automatically map in any of those classification codes that match your system leveraged in Tandem.
That's great, Tim. Thanks for that update. Any plans for Tandem to offer simulation? And this probably is a good question. Bob, as you talked about the maturity model earlier, so the scenario of a mechanical system for an office building, temperature sensors in each room. If I adjust the temperature in one room by 5 degrees, how would it affect the other rooms? So stuff like that.
Yeah, as we think about that later step of portfolio optimizing, that's really where kind of simulation starts to come in. We think there's lots of opportunity to leverage the data in Tandem to do simulation, but it is kind of one step at a time for us right now. First, we got to get that real-time data in, got to be able to visualize it effectively, and then start to use that data we're collecting to do things like optimization, some analytics, and eventually simulation.
Great. Okay, lots of great questions here. Trying to process through them. So we have a question, what are the benefits of doing digital twin on Tandem over Unity?
That is a great question that I flagged for answering here. There are a lot of digital twin solutions out in the market right now, and there's no easy answer to that question. It's a question of what you're trying to achieve and picking the best platform based on what you need to achieve. From an Autodesk perspective, what we're trying to enable with Tandem is a repeatable process from starting with design data, BIM data, starting with collecting construction data, enabling that digital handover, creating a highly repeatable process around that. I think Unity and other platforms are great for creating a bespoke twin where you need to go and create a very custom digital twin for a particular project. Again, I think you have to look at the particular twin that you're trying to create, the project you're creating it for, and then decide on the best tool for the job.
Great, thank you. Another question here, as the platform starts to talk to external vendors, will FedRAMP and other current security protocols be met, or how can we show this to our owners? So it's kind of an interesting question there.
It's a good question. Obviously, Autodesk is working closely in implementing FedRAMP on a number of our solutions. We've been talking about that for a little while now. So as we go forward, we will certainly be implementing all of Autodesk's typical security kind of standards and protocols. We already follow all of the Trust Center practices at Autodesk. We obviously need to go through certification so that we show up in the Trust Center and have our SOC 2 certification and eventually FedRAMP certification. So those are things that are certainly on our roadmap. And as the product matures, like with all other Autodesk solutions, you'll see us adopt those same certifications and compliances.
Great. We have a number of questions here as well regarding what do we plan to integrate with, right? So like there's questions about SCADA, there's a BAC net integration. So is there anything that we're maybe targeting first, or can maybe we speak a little more broadly about where our investment in from an integration standpoint is going to happen?
We're doing two things right now, and Tim and Hallie can jump in on this too. First and foremost is, how do we render and visualize that time series data in context? How do we get it into the cloud, make effective use of it, providing some APIs at that tier? At the same time, we're exploring how we connect to the edge, to a BACnet solution, to other types of building automation systems. Each one use different protocols. So edge technology is something we are exploring right now. Obviously, that would include SCADA systems, that would include building automation systems, building management systems, building control systems of all types. it's a complex landscape of technology out there. And so we are doing a couple of things. One, leaning into our partnerships with companies like Microsoft Azure, AWS, also looking at other technology in the landscape that could help us integrate at the edge. Ali, Tim, anything to add to that?
I would just add that we're also kind of thinking strategically about how our data model is going to align with those systems. So we've been very focused on assets and the kind of feed in from the traditional AEC construction BIM world and how that structures our data. And now we need to take that next step as we add event data, et cetera, and get into this questions of actuation, control, status. And a lot of that ties into, say, the BACnet systems and SCADA systems and how we're considering structuring the data as it comes in through those integrations Bob mentioned.
Yeah, and I've just thrown up a slide for context. We've generally categorized the different connections into these categories, and you know, as Hallie mentioned, we're kind of analyzing how that aligns with our business model and ultimately our data model within Tandem.
I really appreciate all three of you chiming in there. Another really interesting question. We have a user that says that they are using Autodesk Design Review to create an estimate for material quantity. So the question to Tandem is, does Tandem measure time management, automate takeoffs, or any other advantages from an estimating standpoint?
No, not from an estimating standpoint. Certainly there's, you know, conversations we've had with partners on, you know, attic stock and things like that, that an operations team would leverage, or potentially, you know, quote for time and material on work orders. It's something that we anticipate as we make those connections to various systems that there's a desire to do that. But generally speaking, you know, so Bob, myself, and others on this team were actually involved with Autodesk Takeoff as that product was created. So I would just kind of promote, you know, the design review makes sense for what you're doing. It sounds like there's a fit there, and then Autodesk Takeoff is going to have some other automation for, you know, how you're pulling model data together for quantity takeoff purposes.
Thanks, Tim. Here's another question that we get on a fairly regular basis, but currently today, Tandem imports Revit and IFC model data. Any other file formats that we're leaning into in the near future?
Oh, it's a tough question. So there's a lot of post-processing we do on the design data we bring in, and that is why we have been slow to kind of expand that format support out. The post-processing, of course, includes change analysis, the parameter mapping, association of equipment to rooms, etc. So the formats that we're definitely looking at are some of our AutoCAD family of formats, things like Plant 3D. It's an obvious one. Lots of conversation about Navisworks, but it's a very complex format to support because it does not do anything with respect to merging metadata. It does a beautiful job with geometry, but you wind up with a lot of different metadata kind of structures within Navis that make it very difficult to map data into an aggregate environment like Tandem. But certainly we may look at prioritizing some formats within Navisworks as well that are brought into Navis that we could bring cleanly into Tandem. So we are always looking at expanding our format support, and obviously we have a prioritized list of formats that we're thinking about. IFC was very strategic for us, but certainly the AutoCAD family of formats is pretty important.
I'd encourage everyone listening to, if they have a format in mind that's not supported through IFC today, or that they'd rather have directly supported, do feel free to drop that in the chat. We'll certainly take that into our customer insights and aggregate that with the others that we have on our prioritized list.
Or drop it directly as a hint in our roadmap, because the roadmap is interactive on intandem.autodesk.com.
Yep.
Appreciate you heading that way, Bob. I was just going to mention that myself. All right, so we have a few more minutes for questions. One of them, sort of in the same vein, again, that we get asked about fairly frequently, is does Tandem support 3D point clouds? And And with that answer, we'll probably talk a little bit more about how we would handle that kind of workflow.
Go ahead, Bob.
Go ahead, Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, so we do talk about this a lot. We'd anticipate a workflow around a scan to BIM type capability in the future. I see someone mentioned recap as a format to support, but over time, as we think about Tandem, right now our focus is on very clearly, greenfield facilities. So leveraging that design and construction workflow to build out your models, aggregate information, do those services Bob mentioned on that model data, and leveraging BIM, build a repeatable process for structuring your asset information model and defining that digital handover. Over time, as we think about a portfolio, that new build facility is one of many in a portfolio. And those are very frequently, aging facilities at some capacity. Some may have models, likely many don't. And so how do we think about incorporating those facilities into a product like Tandem? And it definitely comes back to, well, if we can incorporate scan data in the future, whether it be through a direct integration or a scan to BIM type workflow to bring that in, we certainly have interest. I will say we are talking to some partners in this space. But not to the point that we're ready to say it's in any kind of near-term capability we'd expect to see.
The recap team is also working with the Forge team to enable point cloud support in the Forge viewer, and that obviously would be a dependency on us directly supporting point clouds in Tandem.
All right, a few more questions. And a number of questions that have to do with sensor information, how we're handling sensor data and that sort of thing. And again, I would just sort of second what Hallie had mentioned earlier about participating in that. If we'll get that email address posted in the chat so it gets back up towards the surface there. Another question that we had was about the frequent renovation of facilities. So what's the workflow to remove assets, add new assets, and revised floor plans? So maybe, Tim, if you could just speak kind of generally about how we're updating information in Tandem, it might be helpful.
Yeah, there are kind of three tiers. Top would be, or easiest is, I have a new pump and the geometry is a generic geometry and I'm managing the metadata. We have a workflow for replacing that data within an asset that hasn't moved. Second tier is something that we do have on our roadmap, not in development at this point, but similar to that discussion we had about editing the geometry or the kind of spatial boundaries. It's something we've talked about as lightweight editing of moving assets or relocating things within Tandem directly without needing to go back to the authoring system. And then the third would be kind of a larger scale renovation. We would expect that information to be updated in the authoring system and incorporated it back into Tandem. What we'd like to do there, and this is, I emphasize because I'm not certain that we're going to be able to do this for quite some time, but we would like to have a workflow where we can provide just the subset of information you need to edit, like across an entire facility. I don't want to open the entire Revit model to edit floor plan 2B and a subset of that to move a couple of walls around. So the idea that we have there is allowing for a subset of information to be shared back with the authoring system to then edit and bring back into Tandem. Again, that's the kind of our hope for the future of that edit workflow with those three separate tiers, but all of those are roadmap items at this point, or the two latter are roadmap point items.
Great, thanks for that, Tim. Real quick, oh yeah, go ahead.
There is a comment: subset of elements can be authorized. It can be like data exchange and ACC. Generally, yes. The conversation we're having right now is with the Forge data exchange team around exactly that. How do I take a subset of information? And so we're engaged with that general discussion at the moment.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question. In terms of lighting, are we considering integration of photometric studies and calculations?
I think that comes back to Bob's comment earlier on simulation. So as the twin matures, there's more opportunity to do simulation, and we can kind of begin looking at the integrations across Autodesk's other portfolio products where there's opportunity to break in doing analysis. But at this stage, it would be more on the capture of the data from that system and the visualization of that, the actual conditions. If there's a study running external and you would be getting results against an external simulation happening in another platform, you could also feed that data back in for visualization purposes into context. I don't know if Bob or Tim wants to expand on that.
Well, good. Thanks, Hallie.
Awesome. Well, Autodesk University is right around the corner. Class proposals are out for the community to make their voices heard. Autodesk University this year will be September 27th through the 29th in New Orleans. There are quite a few that involve Tandem, so we're going to drop a link in the chat so you can vote on classes, and also just so that you guys can be aware of the Tandem focused classes that have been proposed this year. So we're really hoping that you'll participate in that. If you haven't tried Tandem yet, you can sign up for free at intandem.autodesk.com. You can also subscribe to keep up to date on news and future webinars. We will make this recording available, as we mentioned earlier, on the website, on the resources page. We also post it in the Autodesk forum space there as well. We are so grateful for your participation today. The interaction has been fantastic, and we just really enjoy spending this time with you. So thank you for participating. Have a great rest of your week, and thanks for attending today.